This episode of True Crime Conversations is part of our holiday special. Over the summer break here in Australia, we're revisiting some of our favourite episodes from throughout the year, and some that we thought deserved a second listen. So here they are. I'll be back in January with new episodes, so until then, enjoy this special holiday season episode of True Crime Conversations. Just a note before we start, this episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of murder, domestic violence, emotional and physical abuse, assault, and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. Just before 10 a.m. on July the 30th, 2011, Sydney's CBD was quiet. There wasn't as much traffic congestion on Liverpool Street as there was during the busyness of the work week. Residents of nearby apartment buildings sat sipping their coffees at a cafe called The Canopy, looking across at Sydney's Hyde Park. There were a handful of pedestrians, one named Joshua Rathmell, who was on his way to his Saturday shift at the ABC. For some reason, a scene on the 15th level of an apartment building caught his eye from across the road. He thought he might be looking at what he would later describe as a junkie. This man, who appeared agitated, suddenly threw something off his balcony. Luggage, perhaps, or a garbage bag. It would, Joshua would later learn, turn out to be neither. He watched as 30-year-old Lisa Harnum, who weighed less than 50 kilos, was thrown from the 15th floor of her apartment building. So, who was responsible? And what led to that horrific Saturday morning? I'm Jessie Stephens, and this is True Crime Conversations. In this episode, I'm speaking to author and journalist Amy Dale about the murder of 30-year-old woman Lisa Harnum. Her book, The Fall, goes behind the headlines of the shocking crime where a man named Simon Gittany would become a media spectacle. Ray Morris was having a coffee at a Sydney cafe on Liverpool Street with her partner, and they heard a very loud bang outside. When she ran towards it, what did she see that day?
What she saw that day, and what people who were having breakfast and morning coffee at the cafe sort of right on the CBD that really just overlooks straight out onto Hyde Park in the centre of Sydney, was the body of a young woman who had plunged to her death from 15 stories above from one of the apartment buildings.
So there were other witnesses, weren't there? There were like people around, because it's obviously a little quieter on a Saturday morning in that CBD area, but were there passers-by and people sort of even from the apartment?
There is, and as you said, it was quieter than it would normally be had it been a weekday morning, because that's sort of quite near the centre of Sydney. It's right near the Courts building. There's other offices, so there's a lot of coming and going on a weekday, but on a weekend it is a little more quiet. But there is a cafe that actually sits underneath the apartment, and so there was sort of that weekend traffic of people having coffee, having breakfast. There were people who were going to and from on a bus, because that sort of leads down onto Oxford Street in Sydney, so there's a lot of bus and public transport and general traffic. There were also people who were walking through the park. That turned out to be quite critical, the people who, or one person in particular who had been walking through the park. And there were also people in the apartment buildings who did not see anything, but they heard noises and a disturbance.
And what sort of things did they hear?
What they heard was they heard a woman cry out and a woman scream. There was a couple who were living very close to the apartment where the young woman was living, and they heard someone say, "Please help me, God help me." And they sort of didn't really know what to do. I suppose like a lot of people, sometimes when you overhear, a lot of us live in apartments, you might hear people arguing or people screaming out, and there's that hesitation of, do I get involved? What do I do? What can I do? So there were people who heard her cry out for help, but then the next sort of sound after that were the sounds from what the people below on the street level heard, which was very horrific, the sound of the impact of someone hitting the pavement.
And when they saw her, did they look up to try and work out where this person had come from or what had led to this fall?
Some people who were in the cafe probably were aware that it was a cafe that sort of sits underneath an apartment building. So for some people, they probably realised straight away where she had come from, and also from the impact, it was clear that her body had come from a great height. But obviously people were looking around in those initial moments of shock thinking, what has happened, what has gone on? And obviously in those first instances it becomes that, has someone fallen, has someone jumped, are there other factors at play, is it something more sinister than that?
And some witnesses said that they saw a man on the balcony, didn't they? On a balcony sort of 15 levels up.
There were some witnesses who saw that, but they also were from vantage points where it was unclear what the situation was. And this is why one of the witnesses who became an incredibly critical witness, probably the most critical witness in the entire case, what he saw was a man on a balcony. The man was shirtless. He appeared to be agitated and angry. And what he was doing is he was throwing his arms out in sort of a hopeless gesture, but like he was throwing something. But this witness initially thought that it could be a luggage, like a black suitcase, or it could be rubbish. And this is where the apartment building is located. It's sort of near sort of Surrey Hills, starting to head towards sort of the King's Cross area. And his initial reaction was he thought that the man could be drug affected. In his words, he used the words junkie, throwing rubbish off a balcony.
To my perception, without a shirt on, carrying what I thought at the time was a black suitcase or bit of luggage or several items, and it looked to me as though he was unloading them, throwing them off.
And so did that man appear at the actual scene? Because obviously people have found this body, and I imagine that they're trying to call, an ambulance or something. Did this person who had been seen emerge?
He did, but not immediately. So what happened is he was actually due to go to work. He was working in Ultimo, so he continued on with his walk, but then he sort of got to where he was and he reassessed and thought, no, I actually think what I saw was something more sinister than someone throwing rubbish out a window. And that's when he contacted police, who were at that stage were beginning the process of investigating the woman's death.
And so down on the street, a man sort of turns up eventually and says, I'm this woman's fiancé. What was his behaviour like at the time, according to those sort of first witnesses?
A lot of people found him to be in a state of exaggerated distress. So almost like someone putting on a little bit of an act, like someone appearing to be very outwardly distressed, lots of crying out of, oh no, oh no, oh no, saying her name over and over again, that sort of behaviour. Where the apartment building is, it's sort of a very secure, it's sort of quite a luxury apartment building. There's a lot of CCTV footage. There's a lot of security in the building. So the CCTV footage of the apartment, which also became very important at the trial, that captured him in the lift thrashing his arms sort of back and forward, and he just looked so angry. And that was probably one of the sort of important details that emerged at the trial, was he didn't so much appear to be devastated in a sense of devastation. He appeared to be very angry.
After what seemed like quite a while, definitely maybe 4 minutes, I would assume, a man in a white shirt and red pyjamas pants came out and observed the body from a distance for a short while before going crouching next to it and speaking to the people trying to revive her.
Over the next few hours back in Toronto, this woman who was eventually identified as Lisa, her mother is trying to get into contact. Why was she so frantic at that time, having not heard from her daughter for a few hours?
Lisa's mother, Joan, was very distressed at that point in time because Lisa and Joan had been in a lot of contact in the 24 hours leading up to Lisa's death. And that was because Lisa was making quite urgent arrangements to leave Sydney to fly back to Toronto. And Joan, Lisa's mother, had been saying, just come home, book the tickets. She had been logging onto airline sites to the Air Canada website to attempt to book tickets, and they had had a lot of contact back and forward. And Joan was very worried, like a lot of people who have experience with either being in an abusive relationship themselves or knowing someone and being close to someone who has, that those moments of leaving a relationship can be very dangerous. People can be very unstable and angry. She was worried that time had gone past and she hadn't heard anything from Lisa after having been in a lot of contact working out the logistics of booking a flight back to Canada.
Lisa's mum would soon begin texting Simon, pleading with him to reassure her that there was nothing wrong.
Please let me know if she is okay. If you believe in God, Simon, please let me talk to Lisa. Please, Simon, please let me know if she is okay. Please, Simon, this is a mother begging for her child.
And so she received a call, I believe, about 24 hours later, thinking that it was Lisa calling her. What did the person on the other end say?
So this is when Joan received the news that Lisa had been killed. The investigation was only in its infancy, in its very, very early stages. Joan was immediately, obviously, as any mother, I mean, it's an unimaginable, immeasurable loss, but Joan was very immediately convinced that Simon Gittany had had something to do with Lisa's death and that this had not been an accident or a suicide.
I am very sure he was responsible for her death. All he had to do that day when she wanted to leave is let her go. It's as simple as that. Why did you not just let her go? She wanted to go home to her family. That's all she wanted to do.
Can you tell us a little bit about who Lisa was?
So Lisa was Canadian-born. She'd lived in Australia for a number of years at the time of her death. She had grown up with a very close relationship with her mother, Joan, and she also had a brother, Jason, who she was close to. She had been a dancer as a teenager. She was known as an incredibly kind person, very loving toward animals. Joan remembered a time when her daughter went out and bought a sandwich for a homeless man who was sleeping rough in Canada and went and shared a sandwich with him. She subsequently branched out into a career in hairdressing, and a lot of clients also remembered Lisa taking particular care of their children. So she was known as being a very considerate person and a very kind person who always looked for the good in others and always tried to see past people's flaws to see their goodness underneath. That was probably something that in relationships caused her harm, because when there were warning signs about someone's behaviour, she would try to see the good in the relationship and see the good in the person. That was certainly the case with previous relationships that she'd had, and that was a behaviour and a personality trait that also emerged when she began seeing Simon Gittany, which was sort of in the year or so leading up to her death. They had a very intense relationship. They had initially started as friends for a couple of weeks. They were going to live together in a flatmate situation, but it very, very quickly progressed to an intense romantic relationship. And really not that long into the relationship, Simon planned a very elaborate proposal to coincide with Lisa's 30th birthday. There was a dinner done with a lot of Simon's friends and family. Obviously, Lisa, coming from Canada and making a new life for herself in Sydney, she had made friends, but she didn't have any family here, and she had also been quite transient. She'd had periods of time of going to Melbourne, and she'd moved around and had changed jobs and had done a couple of different courses, so didn't really have a very settled group of friends, had made friends but not a very close-knit group and with no family here. So when that proposal took place, it was in front of Simon's family and friends.
And when you say the proposal wasn't long after they sort of met, are we talking months?
It was months, so it was sort of coming up to that 1 year mark.
Right. And what did people who were close to the couple, what sort of relationship did they describe them as having?
So Lisa's mother didn't have any sort of face-to-face contact with Simon, because when Lisa had made trips back to Canada in the time that she was with Simon, she had gone alone. But Joan was very aware that when Lisa was in Canada, she would spend a lot of time on the phone with Simon. He would call all the time. He would message all the time. He would always want to know where she was, what she was doing, who she was with. So Joan had been quite worried, and even there was one point when Lisa was back in Canada and Joan and Lisa were just out shopping and Simon was calling all the time, constantly interrupting what they were doing. And, you know, for mother and daughter, they don't spend a lot of one-on-one face-to-face time with each other. It was sort of a nice chance for them to spend that time together, and it was just a constant interruption of Simon being, where are you? What are you doing? Who are you with? And in the end, Joan actually sort of took the phone and sort of said to Simon, kind of, can you back off and give us this time together? And she's just with me. There were also other friends of Lisa's who were a little bit unsure of Simon and found some of his behaviour quite controlling and quite coercive. Lisa also sort of formed relationships with a personal trainer and a life coach who were also assisting her both with physical health and mental health and well-being. And those women in particular were very important in helping Lisa start to make preparations to leave Simon, but they were both sort of aware quite early on within their dealings with Lisa that something was not right with Simon.
Simon and Lisa were quite into fitness and physical activity, weren't they? Because I think I remember reading that she said she'd never spent as much time in the gym as she did in those early months together. So is that something sort of critical to their relationship?
It was. Simon was probably a bit of a gym junkie, worked out a lot. Lisa was also in a stage of trying to put on a little bit of weight. I mean, she'd been a dancer, she was very slim, and there had been some discussion with Simon and Lisa about the possibility of having children. But because Lisa was at that point probably a little bit underweight, and so Simon arranged for her to have sessions with a personal trainer to begin the process of trying to build muscle and to put on a little bit of weight.
Because Lisa was 30 and Simon was a little bit older. I believe he was around 40.
Yeah, there was sort of a just under 10-year age gap.
Yeah, and what did Simon do for a living?
So there was always a little bit of confusion and questioning about what Simon Gittany actually did for a living. As we've sort of touched on about the apartment building, it was a very big apartment, a brand new, quite luxurious apartment building sort of in the heart of Sydney that looks out right over Hyde Park. The rent on the apartment was about $1,600 a week.
Wow.
So not cheap. And there was always confusion about where exactly Simon was getting his money from. At the trial, he talked about that he was working in a sort of health supplements company, so working on distributing health supplements, vitamins, those sorts of things to people. And there was also a family business that he was involved in. It was a shoe business. That was something that he had started up with one of his sisters.
And he'd had actually a criminal history, hadn't he?
He did. It wasn't incredibly extensive, but there had been some violence in Simon's past.
And was that towards men or women?
It was actually towards a male. It was towards a male police officer. So this had happened when he was a fair bit younger. There had been an incident and a police officer had been called to the home. In the course of that discussion, there had been an altercation, and there was actually a part of the policeman's ear that was very, very badly damaged as a result of that altercation. And there had also been another incident involving drugs, which Simon had said came because the drugs had been left in the car, and so that he had had nothing to do with the actual distribution of the drugs themselves, that he had been the unlucky person sort of left holding the baby, so to speak.
Former New South Wales police officers Keith Bristow and David Burgess join me now. Gents, good morning to you. Keith, Rachel Louise, she says Gittany didn't know you were police officers.
Well, that's certainly not the case. When we arrived at the address, we produced our police identifications to his mother. Gittany wasn't there when we arrived. When he did arrive a short time later, we produced our IDs again to him. He was fully aware of who we were and where we were from.
Okay, and still bit your ear off, basically.
Didn't stop him from doing that, no.
And so he's someone who's really into the gym, and he's apparently into these sort of fitness supplements and stuff. Was there any talk of steroid use? Because he was a very big man.
There was some talk about it, and there actually were, within the police brief of evidence compiled against Simon Gittany, there were photos of Simon injecting into his biceps with what appeared to be an anabolic steroid. So there was certainly speculation. It wasn't something that was sort of brought into evidence in the murder case, I suppose because the decision had been made by the Crown that to focus specifically on the evidence and the facts of the murder, the physical element of the murder, and not other parts of Simon's life that appeared murky or potentially criminal. But there was certainly some speculation, and certainly there were photographs that the police had of him with steroids, what appeared to be steroids.
And because steroids can make you quite aggressive, can't they?
Yes. So that's always, people often talk about the idea of roid rage.
Yeah.
And it was certainly an interesting idea that was, I suppose, unspoken in the court, but I suppose a sort of a murmuring among people who were involved in the case that, you had images of Simon on CCTV, very angrily thrashing his arms around, appearing to have these outbursts. There were people who had been subjected to these outbursts, the sort of personal trainer and the life coach who had been helping Lisa, had been subject to these very threatening messages and calls and had been on the receiving end of that fury. And actually one of the words that was suggested to Simon that characterised his behaviour by the Crown prosecutor in the trial was the word apoplectic, and that the murder had come at a moment when Simon had become apoplectic with rage.
And so we have sort of, as you said, Joan, Lisa's mother, suggesting that there were signs that he was psychologically, emotionally abusive and controlling. Were there any signs that he was physically abusive during their relationship?
There had only been one incident that was suggested in the trial, that it had potentially been a physical assault. There was one incident that Lisa had suffered a sort of minor fracture. It was brought into evidence in the trial, but not really laboured over extensively. The trial focused overwhelmingly on the emotional, psychological, coercive behaviour by Simon. It was probably a unique trial in that way, in that it was probably one of the first ones, certainly that I can remember, that had really focused on the idea of emotional and psychological abuse and that pattern of coercion and of isolation. So by the time that Lisa had died, she was completely isolated. She was no longer working. She had been sort of cut off from anyone who she had a relationship with. Her family is overseas. She had felt like she was unable to leave the house day to day, but their relationship was not categorised by ongoing physical abuse. So it was an interesting trial in that way, and I think making people very aware and alive to the fact that domestic violence isn't just black eyes and broken bones and daily constant abuse, that someone can be in very, very real fear of their life but not be experiencing ongoing physical abuse.
It's almost like a textbook case with these people. 1 minute it's, I love you and you're beautiful, and then it's the violence, and then I love you and you're beautiful. It's taking control of their lives through various venues, stopping them from seeing their friends, saying it's better if they don't associate with these people. All the venues that he used, the taping and tracking on her cell phone, because she didn't know a lot of that until the end. And just alienating her from the outside world slowly and making her believe that this is where she belonged and this was right and he was right for her and he was only doing this for her benefit, which in fact it was not.
And to go back to that Saturday morning in the apartment, what do we know about Lisa's final days?
So we know that in Lisa's final days, she was spending a lot of time trying to sort of reach out to her mum. We also found out in the course of the trial that she was actually taking a number of steps to leave Simon and to do it in a way that he would not find out. So this was not a case of someone saying, I'm unhappy with the relationship and I'm going to move out for a little while. She was taking a lot of very intelligent steps and thinking about it very clearly. She using sort of some assistance from the trainer, Lisa, who is also called Lisa, and the life coach, Michelle. They had also been helping her in terms of taking some clothing and putting it in a storage facility in Bondi Junction, but doing it in a way that it was not a lot, so nothing that would really go noticed. So it's not like Simon would come home and say, why half of your clothes gone? This was just a very small amount. So she was starting to begin that process of taking steps to leave. She had also written on a piece of paper, there are cameras inside and outside the house. Obviously, in the trial, we could never find out. No one ever came forward and said that message was intended for me or I saw it. Obviously, Lisa was no longer here to explain who had been the intended audience of the message. And the note had been torn up. So it was actually found in the pocket of her clothing after she died. But whether or not she maybe believed that there was an audio bugging in the house, so it could have been that she could have written it down. If someone had been in the house, it could have been something to pass to them so they could read it, and so to know to be careful of what they were saying. She was aware that her sort of messages and emails were being tracked and looked at, and Simon did admit in the trial that he had monitored her communication. He said that this was because there had been a breach of trust in their relationship, and that's why he did it. And he conceded, yes, I was jealous, but sort of framed that in a way of saying there had been something that had breached my trust, therefore I had taken these steps to monitor what she was doing and who she was communicating with. He also said that she had said to him, I've got a secret, and she wouldn't disclose what the secret was. And so his reasoning for tracking her communication was a bit to find out what her secret was. No other witness spoke about this. No one else said, yes, I'm aware what Lisa's secret was, or Lisa talked to me all the time about having a secret. So there's certainly the evidence, and the note in particular was a very chilling piece of evidence because it really was a voice beyond the grave, and it really was, I think, terrifying. And I think for everyone in the court to all of a sudden realise that her fear, that she felt that she needed to write that down. We don't know who she intended to read it. We don't know if it was her putting it in her pocket as a warning if something did happen to her, to alert someone to attempt to look at the footage that had been recorded in the apartment. But it's certainly a very chilling insight into the level of fear that she was experiencing at that time.
The Supreme Court has heard that a woman allegedly thrown to her death from a Sydney apartment building had planned to leave her fiancé. 39-year-old Simon Gittany has pleaded not guilty to murdering Lisa Harnum during a heated argument at their home 2 years ago. Prosecutors say he'd become so possessive of Miss Harnum, he was secretly monitoring her phone calls and text messages.
Because even the moving clothing out in bits, I mean, that to me indicates a high level of fear. And the cameras in the house is quite unusual, especially at that time, to have more than one security camera in a home that you're sort of living in by yourself. Did he talk about that, why he would have so many cameras set up or anything?
He talked about the security cameras as sort of a need for general security. He tried to distance himself from an idea that they were put in to monitor Lisa's comings and goings. He said that their relationship was not like that. He tried to emphasise that Lisa did have freedom within the relationship, that she had travelled overseas back to Canada, that he had encouraged her to go to the gym. He also said that it had been her decision to stop working, that it had been her decision to cut off friendships with certain people. So he tried to, I suppose, justify and explain those, but he didn't describe the cameras as being something that was specifically so he could monitor Lisa. Some of the specific monitoring, as I said, of her emails or messages was because he said that there had been a breach of trust in the relationship, but other forms of CCTV and security cameras, he said, was more for general security.
Because what's a sort of bizarre detail in this is that when he did come downstairs after Lisa had fallen, he said quite soon after, check the cameras, which you just wouldn't think would be the first place your mind would necessarily go when you've lost your fiancé. What did the cameras in the apartment find?
So what one of the cameras found, and that was the image that when people think back to the trial, it's probably the image that sticks out the most in people's minds, and that's the image of Lisa with a hand clamped over her mouth. It's Simon's hand that is around her mouth and her face. So that was 60 seconds before she plunged to her death. So that was when Lisa had attempted to run out. So after the period of taking some items of clothing and putting things in storage and doing it in incremental bits so as to not arouse suspicion with Simon that she was leaving, this was the moment where it was, no, right, I'm just getting out. So that was when she made a break to try to run out of the apartment. That was when neighbours had overheard someone saying, "Please help me, God help me." Simon admitted that he had dragged her back inside. I mean, it was probably difficult for him to suggest otherwise because it was on the footage. He said that was because they had been having a fight and he wanted to resolve the fight, and that she had come back inside after that and sat down, and he was in the process of making her a cup of tea before she went outside to the balcony. But what that image very clearly showed was a woman running for her life and her partner dragging her back inside to the apartment, and within a minute she was dead.
And was there any other sort of forensic evidence or fingerprinting or anything that was found in that apartment that could be used in the trial?
There was some interesting fingerprint evidence, which also together with some of the eyewitness testimony and the CCTV was a very critical part of the prosecution case. And that was because Simon told a very specific story about what had happened on the balcony, and that had been that Lisa had settled after she had been brought back inside the apartment. He was in the process of making her a cup of tea. And remember, he's telling this in terms of that things have de-escalated very quickly. So this has gone from her making a sprint, for her life outside the door to within 30 seconds saying, okay, yes, I'll have a cup of tea.
And then 30 seconds later being dead. So he said that he had gone to the kitchen to begin the preparation of the tea. He had then noticed that Lisa had gone out onto the balcony and that she was climbing over it. So what was one interesting factor is in this, Lisa had her bag on her shoulder, which was an interesting thing and probably a slightly gendered observation in court, because I think for a lot of women it's, well, if you have come back inside an apartment or a home and you're sort of preparing to stay there, you take your bag off your shoulder. I mean, your bag on your shoulder is I'm leaving. But her bag had stayed on her shoulder. So Simon said that he saw her go out onto the balcony and that she had begun the process of climbing out over the balcony. And there was sort of an awning and some sort of slat-like awning. And so his recollection of it was that she had begun the process of climbing over. He said whether or not to frighten him or whether or not to because she was thinking of jumping. And so he saw her do that and that she had slipped and that he had then come over and tried to save her, but he had been unable to because she had sort of slipped onto the sort of awning near the apartment that was immediately below, and that it was too late and he wasn't able to do it. So what was critical in this was the fingerprint evidence, and they actually said that fingerprint, to try and extract them from glass, is very good. Glass is a very porous surface, so if people's fingerprints have been on a surface, it's actually quite easy to pick it up compared to some other surfaces. But the fingerprint evidence didn't match what Simon had said, because this idea that Lisa had then sort of clung onto the balcony and climbed over, it wasn't matched by the fingerprint evidence. Her fingerprints were not on the glass. You wouldn't be able to jump without using your hands.
Yeah, exactly. So she wasn't going to be able to. So they were saying, well, your suggestion doesn't match the fingerprint evidence, because you would say that if she had then taken the steps to climb over, she would have put her hands on the glass. You would think she would be probably pressing quite firmly if she was using that to sort of put her body weight over. Whereas Lisa's fingerprints were not on the surface of the glass at all, which is more consistent with the Crown version of events, which is that Lisa's hands were never on the glass at all, because very shortly, seconds after being dragged back inside the apartment, she'd been rendered unconscious and that she was thrown.
He's actually seen unloading Lisa Harnum.
So he's holding her like this, and he magically unloads her through the balustrade, which is 121 centimetres.
1.2 metres high.
I think it's 1.21.
How high is Simon?
He's probably about 169.
The judge accepts that Lisa must have been unconscious.
Well, if he renders her unconscious, then he's got to pick her up and...
How heavy is she?
She's 50 kilos.
Do you believe Simon could pick up a woman?
Absolutely not. I don't think that.
And so was the belief that she was unconscious before she was thrown from the balcony?
That was in the sort of final moments of the verdict that the judge, Justice Lucy McCallum, did, which was a sort of a 5-hour, a very lengthy judgment, which is very different to jury verdicts where it just comes back as guilty or not guilty. But because this case was heard by a judge only, there were very detailed written reasons given for the verdict. And she had the belief that at some point Lisa had been rendered unconscious, or that Simon had done something that he was able to restrain her. Because one of the things that the defence had pointed to was that Simon didn't have any scratches or anything over him. So a defence point was that, well, if she had been fighting for her life and she knew that he was moving with her to throw her over the balcony, that she would be fighting for her life, that she'd be scratching him, that she'd be leaving some mark on him, and he didn't have any marks on him. So that was where the formation of the idea came, that she had been rendered unconscious or incapable of fighting back.
Why was it that the case was seen by a judge and not a jury?
It was actually an interesting legal reason. So as the trial neared, Simon did not have legal representation. It's not ideal in, well, really any court case, but particularly a case where you're facing spending the rest of your life in jail, to be unrepresented. Obviously, the preference is that you have legal counsel.
Was that his choice?
So he said there was a financial reason that he was unable to have a lawyer, and that he wouldn't be able to pay for a lawyer for about 6 weeks. And so generally, jury trials take longer than judge-alone trials because there's legal argument. The jury might have to be sent in and out. The process can be just take a little bit longer, so it tends to just add a couple of days or a couple of weeks to the process. So if they had a judge-alone trial, they could cut the trial length. Otherwise, Simon said they would like an adjournment to be able to push it into the future, which would enable him to seek legal representation to be able to have his defence funded for the whole of the trial. Because you also don't want a situation where someone's represented for a few weeks and then as you get closer to closing arguments, suddenly you're without a lawyer. The Crown didn't want the case to get delayed into another year. So this was in 2013. They didn't want it to go into another year because the witness who we were talking about a little bit earlier, Josh Rathmell, who had been walking through the park, and he was the person who thought it was initially a drug-affected person throwing rubbish, but had sort of since become very critical in terms of what he had seen, which was a man throwing an object. The object he sort of came to realise in his recollection was the body of Lisa. He was moving overseas. He had sort of indicated that he didn't want to come back to Australia to give evidence once he had moved overseas, that he had an availability window in 2013. That window would not be there in 2014. Obviously, he was incredibly critical to the Crown case. So there was no real dispute on either side that to have a judge-alone trial.
And that trial was enormous. I remember it at the time. It was covered extensively. And one thing that I recall from the time is his girlfriend being present. He had a new girlfriend. And so I remember was she convinced of his innocence? Because she spoke to the media at the time, didn't she?
Yeah, she was. So Simon, by the time of the trial, so that had been about 2 years after Lisa had died. So Simon had been on bail, which is not necessarily unusual with people who are accused of murders of that type, because there had been at that point no suggestion that Simon was a threat to the community more broadly. There was no concern that he would fail to appear. So he had been on bail for the time since sort of from a few months after he was charged. So when he was initially charged, he was bail refused, but he subsequently got it some months later. So he did appear on the first day of the trial with a new partner, Rachel Louise. Rachel was very friendly with the media at the start. She would be quite chatty. She would talk to you, acknowledge you. She was steadfastly of the belief that Simon was innocent and that he was being blamed for something that was most likely an accident, accepted Simon's version of events, that it had appeared that Lisa had climbed over and then had slipped. as it got closer to the end of the trial, the relationship sort of, probably I'm using the term relationship a bit generously, but the sort of friendliness did start to wane. And by the end of the verdict, she was quite angry toward the media. And then I think particularly by the verdict, people might recall the day of the verdict that she sort of raced out after the verdict was handed down, and she sort of lit a cigarette and she took out her phone and started filming the media. And she did then start to blame the media or see them as somehow also culpable in Simon's guilt, in the finding of Simon's guilt.
Just minutes after screaming and collapsing upon hearing her boyfriend had been found guilty of murder, Rachel Louise emerged from court for a quiet cigarette.
Does anyone have a lighter on them?
She was surrounded by a huge media pack, but for several minutes just stood there smoking, ignoring every question about Simon Gittany and the day's events.
And what happened to them after he was found guilty and obviously sent to prison? Was that the end of their relationship, or did she continue to sort of visit him?
She did. They did stay together for a while. The last that I heard, which was a couple of years ago, was that they were no longer together. And she subsequently confirmed that they were no longer together. She also said in a media interview, she did a sit-down interview with Sunday Night in the months after the verdict and just before the sentencing, she sort of alluded to the fact that because Simon was facing, a very lengthy jail term, sort of nearly 20 years as a non-parole period, and then also quite a long parole period, which is also not necessarily an indication that he was going to get out after 18 years. It's also he was facing the possibility of a further up to 8 years behind bars. By that stage, Rachel would be, well past the age of being able to have kids. So she said that she and Simon had talked about the idea, and Simon had sort of encouraged her to move on, to find someone else and to build a life and a family with, particularly after he had an unsuccessful appeal. But they did stay together for, at least a number of months. And she remained quite outspoken about his innocence and that she believed that there had been a miscarriage of justice, but they're sort of 5 years down the track, they're not together anymore.
If Simon made her, as the defence submitted in the case, if Simon made her distressed, fearful and desperate, doesn't that make him culpable?
No, those are her own actions, not Simon's.
And what were the reasons for his appeal? What were the grounds for sort of pressing the court with an appeal?
It was a very narrow appeal. So it really just came down to the unreliability of the key witness. So that was Josh Rathmill, who had been the witness who had been walking through Hyde Park. So it was a very, very particular appeal ground. Some of that was probably to do with the fact that it had been a judge-alone trial and you had a judge who had made the findings of fact in the case. She had given, 5 hours, thousands of words of reasoning as to how she had reached that verdict. And often in appeals, there'll be appeal grounds that will have to do with the jury and how the jury were instructed, and things like the closing address to the jury or things like that, or that there was an improper instruction or that things were not handled or explained to them as they should have been. Now, obviously, none of those were on the table for Simon. He couldn't make any findings like that because you're not dealing with a jury, you were dealing with a judge. So rather, the appeal rested on a very, very specific appeal ground, which was that the key witness had been unreliable and that there hadn't been enough information presented to the judge about the known flaws of eyewitness testimony, that people can recall things incorrectly, people can be sure of things when it turns out they don't happen. And there is a body of research into the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, but the judge was particularly impressed with Josh Rathmill as a witness. And she also did draw attention to the fact that in the course of his testimony, he was not a dogged witness. He was not someone who was completely blinded by defensiveness of what he had seen. He was quite open in parts that he had to accept that he could be wrong, but that he was believing to the very best of his ability that he had seen what he had seen, and he was telling the court that that's what he had seen, but accepting that there could be a chance that he was wrong. Justice McCallum was actually very impressed with him as a witness and saying the fact that he is sort of prepared to acknowledge that there is uncertainty in some ways lends more credibility to his honesty, because he isn't someone who is feeling under attack or feeling defensive and saying, no, I definitely saw this. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. He was accepting that memory, like so many things, is subject to human error, but that he had believed what he had seen to be true. So it was very narrow appeal ground, and it was unsuccessful.
And there was also other evidence that backed up what he believed he saw, which is, even if that was thrown out, then it's difficult to see what would have happened otherwise.
Exactly. There were plenty of other points of evidence. The case didn't live and die on Josh Rathmell's testimony. The fingerprint evidence certainly was very supportive of the Crown case. There was a body of evidence about Simon and Lisa's relationship, about Simon's coercion, the power and control that he exercised over her. So it was certainly not something that Josh Rathmell was the only part of the Crown case. So it was obviously there was other evidence there.
Balcony killer Simon Gittany has lost his appeal against his conviction for the murder of fiancé Lisa Harnum. His lawyers argued a key witness who testified seeing Gittany unload an object from an apartment balcony was unreliable, but the Court of Criminal Appeal found there was no basis for the claim. Gittany's minimum 18-year jail term still stands.
And I think the most important question with cases like this, something that perhaps we can learn, and I know at the time it was explored at length, what do you think that this case can tell us about the nature of domestic violence in Australia and perhaps things that we've missed in the past?
I think this case was critical in making people aware of the ideas of coercion, of psychological power and control, and of emotional abuse. I think that we have, in the past several years, sort of come on in leaps and bounds in what we know and understand of domestic violence. But I think even in 2013, and that was sort of just prior to when Luke Batty was killed in Melbourne by his father, and Rosie Batty sort of courageously emerged as this real voice in the domestic violence space and has become a real leader in the space. But the Gittany case also happened at a time there was the Baden Clay case up in Queensland that was also emerging as a very high-profile domestic violence case. Some of those cases explored the ideas of, I think as Rosie Batty put very eloquently, it doesn't matter how nice your house is, it doesn't matter where you live. This is something that happens to everybody. The Baden Clay case was probably one sort of similar to that in terms of a very sort of affluence and a sort of family doing well, but underneath the surface there's a darkness and a violence. And I think with the Gittany case, it probably made people finally completely aware that the idea of, well, he's not hitting me, that just because that's not happening, that it doesn't mean that there's not domestic violence taking place. So I think that Lisa's story has been, and her legacy is really making people aware that those patterns of behaviour, that controlling behaviour, and also sort of making people alert to it, that they might see it in their own relationships, they could see it in relationships of people that they're close to, and hopefully an earlier awareness of that behaviour, that something's not right, that the more people are aware of that earlier on in relationships, hopefully more people are able to get out of those situations before it's too late.
Definitely. And I think as well it really highlighted the danger of leaving. And often we are telling women, we ask them why they stayed. And in a case like this, we saw what happened. She was being incredibly courageous and intelligent, as you said, about her means of escape. And this is how dangerous partners can be. And I think it was a really important story for that reason, and that Australia, I don't think we'll ever forget it.
No, I think absolutely. I think you've summed it up really well. That I think certainly in the past there was this idea of, well, why don't people just leave? And it highlighted the dangers when you do leave. And I think made people aware that domestic violence has many faces, takes many human forms. This is one of them. When people talk and experience instances where they are completely cut off from friends and family, they're economically cut off, they're isolated, that just because they're not emerging on the street with bloody noses and broken bones doesn't mean that they're not in danger, and that their lives aren't at risk and that support needs to be given to victims of that sort of coercion and power and control to leave a relationship like that before it's too late.
Exactly right. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today, Amy.
Thank you very much.
We will always mourn the loss of our beautiful Lisa Cecilia and are working towards making her legacy a powerful wake-up call to young women and to parents, siblings, and friends of these young women to be aware of the warning signs of a controlling relationship and take a proactive approach to assisting them.
You can buy Amy Dale's book, The Fall, at all good bookstores or by following the links in the description of this episode. For photos, court documents and extra reading on the case, don't forget to join our closed Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook. You can also contact the show by emailing truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stephens, and produced by Elise Cooper.
Summer is here, and with the kids getting excited for school holidays, now is the perfect time to get a Taronga Zoo Friends membership. Whether you want to keep up with the meerkat mob or watch the Sumatran tiger cubs tussle, the whole family will love exploring the zoo. And with over 20 keeper shows and talks a day, no two visits are the same. Experience 365 days of zoo fun from just $99 for an adult and 2 kids with the Taronga Zoo Friends membership. This deal gets you unlimited access to our zoos, discounts at our shops and eateries, priority seating at our shows, and much more. Not only that, but because Taronga Zoo is not for profit, your membership will support our conservation projects essential to Australian and international wildlife. Head to taronga.org.au/zoofriends to find out more and join.